You'd think after 40 years of measuring other people's property lines, I'd know exactly where mine ended. But apparently, my homeowners association thought otherwise. Funny thing about land, it doesn't move. People just forget where it stops being theirs. Every morning for the past 20 years, I've sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee, a worn-out flannel shirt, and a dog who listens better than most board members. The sprinklers hum in the distance. The air smells faintly of lake water and gasoline from someone's mower, and the mail truck rolls by like clockwork. Life here in Lakeview Estates was calm, predictable, exactly the way I liked it. The house sat at the edge of a man-made lake, surrounded by those identical HOA-approved homes with beige siding and mailboxes that matched like cloned robots. Mine looked different. Built in the 70s, back before this place even existed. It was my father's fishing cabin once, expanded little by little, until it became a proper home. Behind me stretched 1,500 acres of forest and pasture, our family land since before zoning boards were even invented. That property was my retirement plan, my peace, my proof that patience pays off. I didn't have much use for the HOA. Never needed them, never attended a meeting. They kept to their cul-de-sacs. I kept to my fields. It was an unspoken truce. Sure, I got the occasional newsletter about community beautification projects and mandatory mailbox updates, but I figured those rules were for the Vinyl Palace crowd, not an old cabin sitting technically outside their jurisdiction. The folks on the board, though, they lived for rules, especially Marjorie Benson. She was the type of person who color-coded her grocery list. Always walked her dog right past my gate at the same time every morning, pretending she was just enjoying the lake view, even though her eyes lingered on my mailbox like it had committed a crime. Her husband, Jim, never said a word, just nodded behind her like a backup dancer to bureaucracy. It started with small talk. "Tom, you ever think about paving your driveway? Gravel just looks so unfinished." I smiled politely. "That's the point, Marge. I like it unfinished." She smiled tighter. "Well, consistency is important in a community." I remember thinking, "Lady, I live on 1,500 acres. The only thing consistent out here are the mosquitoes." The HOA had been trying to expand its oversight for years. They'd send out surveys about merging adjacent lands into their community zone. I tossed every one of those papers straight into the burn barrel behind the shed. They couldn't actually make that happen without permission, or so I thought. One morning, I was sipping coffee, watching the fog lift off the lake when the mail truck stopped at my gate. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the thick white envelope marked Property Compliance Notice. Immediate attention required. I figured it was junk mail or some mix-up, but when I opened it, I actually laughed out loud. "Dear Mr. Redding," it began, "our records indicate your adjacent land has not been maintained in accordance with Lakeview community standards. Please mow or clear debris within 14 days to avoid fines." I sat there rereading it, thinking, adjacent land? They couldn't mean my property. 1,500 acres of woodland. Then I saw the attached map. Sure enough, they'd outlined my land in bright yellow and labeled it Community Greenbelt Expansion. For a long second, I just stared at it. Then I let out a slow laugh that turned into a sigh. "You've got to be kidding me," I said out loud. Scout tilted his head like he agreed. That afternoon, I drove over to the HOA office, a converted pool house that smelled faintly of chlorine and copier toner. Marge sat behind a folding table stacked with paperwork, wearing a name badge like she worked for NASA. "Tom, so good to see you," she said, her smile tightening when she realized I wasn't here to volunteer. "What can we help you with today?" I held up the letter. "Got a notice about mowing. Just wanted to clarify, I don't think that applies to me." She blinked, flipping through her clipboard. "Well, the records show that your land is part of the Lakeview boundary. It's been designated as shared community green space." "By who?" I asked. "The board approved the update last month," she said, all prim and proper. "We're expanding oversight of undeveloped areas to preserve the community aesthetic." I just stared at her. "You realize that undeveloped area is my property, right?" Been in my family since before your bylaws were a twinkle in a lawyer's eye. She gave a polite, condescending smile. Oh, I'm sure it's just paperwork. But until it's corrected, we do need you to comply with the maintenance requirements. The grass, the downed branches, that old shed. It reflects on everyone. I almost laughed again. Marge, that shed's older than your subdivision. It was built by my grandfather. I understand, but we all have to follow the rules. I nodded slowly, biting back a grin. You're absolutely right. Rules are important. Then I walked out before she could say another word. Driving home, I thought about that word, rules. Rules were fine when they made sense. But this wasn't a rule. It was nonsense dressed in legalese. Still, I figured it was a mix-up. Maybe someone clicked the wrong parcel ID or an intern got overeager with a map overlay. I dealt with county mistakes before. Bureaucracy runs on caffeine and confusion. That night, I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the tree line. The crickets were starting up, and the lake caught the last bit of light like molten glass. I tried to shrug it off. But something about that conversation stuck with me. The way she said shared green space. Like she already believed it. Like my land wasn't mine anymore. Just a backdrop for her HOA-approved vision of community. The next morning, I saw two people in neon vests walking along my fence line, clipboard in hand, snapping photos with their phones. I walked down the drive, trying to keep my temper in check. Can I help you folks? One of them, a young guy with a sunburn, said, just documenting the greenbelt perimeter for the HOA, sir. I looked at him, then at the property behind him, the greenbelt he was standing on. My property. You mean my perimeter? I corrected. He frowned, flipping through his papers. Says here it's part of Lakeview Estate's common area. Does it say that on my deed? I asked. He didn't answer, just took another picture. I walked back up to the house muttering, unbelievable. By the time the next letter came, the humor had worn off. It was labeled Final Notice and included a fine of $250 for failure to comply. They'd even stapled a photo, taken from my own gate, showing overgrown grass and a fallen branch like it was evidence in a trial. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper. Scout laid his head on my foot, sensing something off. You know what, buddy? I said quietly. They just drew the wrong line on the map, and they're about to learn why you don't mess with someone who knows where the lines actually are. That night, I opened an old file drawer in the study. Inside were dusty blueprints, plat maps, survey pins, deeds, records going back decades. My family had been careful with paperwork. I'd helped file some of it myself when I worked for the county. Every measurement, every boundary marker, recorded down to the inch. I wasn't angry yet, just curious. How does an HOA even think they can claim 1,500 acres that aren't theirs? Did they really believe adding a few lines on a digital map made it true? I poured another cup of coffee, laid the letter flat, and smiled to myself. Bureaucrats always overplay their hand. And this time, they'd picked the wrong neighbor to push around. When I finally turned off the porch light that night, the lake was still. The air felt heavier somehow, like the start of a storm you can't see yet, but you know it's coming. That letter changed everything. I figured that one polite conversation would clear things up. A mix-up, a clerical hiccup, and a few signatures later we'd all laugh about it at the next barbecue. After all, who in their right mind thought they could claim 1,500 acres that didn't belong to them? But as I'd soon learn, the HOA didn't rely much on the right mind, just the right forms. About a week after my friendly visit with Marge, I got another envelope. Same letterhead, same smug logo with the little tree, and the slogan, Preserving Harmony Through Rules. Inside was a $500 fine for failure to maintain shared visual perimeter. It even came with color photos. My own trees, circled in red like they'd been caught committing a crime. I called the number on the notice, hoping to talk to a rational person. Instead, I got a voicemail menu that sounded like it had been designed by a bureaucrat on sedatives. Press 1 for dues. Press 2 for violations. Press 3 for appeals, which automatically redirected to a full mailbox. I hung up before I hit 4, which I assumed was for confessions. 2 days later, I noticed a few people in fluorescent vests putting up temporary plastic signs along my fence. I walked out to ask what they were doing. One woman said, "Community Greenbelt, residents only." I asked her who told her to post that. "The HOA board," she replied without looking up, hammering another stake into the dirt on my side of the fence. It was surreal, watching strangers claim your land while you stood 10 feet away from them. "Ma'am," I said calmly, "if you take one more step, you'll be trespassing." She frowned like I'd just spoken another language. "Sir, we're following the approved boundary map." "Which one?" I asked. "The real one or the fantasy one?" She didn't answer. They packed up and left, muttering something about non-compliant residents. By the following week, the gossip started. One of my neighbors, Doug, nice guy, too many cargo shorts, stopped me by the mailbox. "Hey Tom, heard you got into it with the HOA. They said you're refusing to maintain the new community area." "The community area," I repeated. "That happens to have my barn on it?" He shrugged. "Yeah, I don't get it either." Marge said something about updating the maps to keep property values up. "Then she better start with her husband's lawn gnome collection," I said. Doug laughed but looked nervous, like even agreeing with me was against the rules. A few days later, the HOA newsletter arrived. Front page headline, "Lakeview expands Greenbelt, preserving our shared beauty." Beneath it was a cheerful paragraph about newly incorporated land, enhancing the neighborhood's value. There was even a blurry photo of my property with the caption, "Newly managed area, thanks to the HOA compliance team." I nearly spit out my coffee. Managed? They couldn't manage a lemonade stand. Helen, my sister-in-law, called that night after hearing about the newsletter from a friend in town. "Tom, don't stir the pot," she warned. "You're retired. You don't need the stress." "I'm not stirring it," I said. "They're the ones sticking their spoon in my soup." Then she dropped her favorite line, "You can't fight a committee." I smiled, staring out at the dark field beyond the porch. "Helen, I used to draw maps for the county. Committees get lost the second the GPS dies." A couple of days later, I got another fine, this time $1,000 for unauthorized use of community property. The alleged violation, personal farming activity. They'd taken drone pictures of me on my tractor mowing my own pasture. Apparently, I was now a squatter on my family's land. I decided it was time to attend a meeting. The monthly HOA gathering was held in the community center, a beige block of a building that smelled like burnt coffee and mild despair. Folding chairs lined up in rows, a whiteboard at the front, and a box of stale donuts that looked like they'd been purchased during the Reagan administration. Marge sat at the front table with her laptop open, flanked by 2 board members who nodded at everything she said, like dashboard bobbleheads. The meeting began with roll call, a prayer for orderly discussion, and immediately devolved into complaints about recycling bins. When it came time for new business, Marge cleared her throat. "Now, regarding the ongoing noncompliance with the new Greenbelt maintenance requirements." She paused dramatically, scanning the room. "Certain property owners have refused to follow our updated standards. As a result, we've had to issue formal violations." Every head in the room turned toward me. I raised my hand. "Would one of those certain property owners happen to be sitting right here?" Marge smiled that tight-lipped politician smile. "Tom, this isn't personal. We're simply enforcing the bylaws." "Bylaws?" I repeated. "So which bylaw says you can redraw private property lines?" "It's part of Section 4A, Community Oversight of Adjacent Lands," she said quickly, flipping through a binder thicker than a church hymnal. "I've read Section 4A, I said. "It covers shared fences, landscaping along property boundaries, and holiday decoration colors. Nothing about annexing 1,500 acres. A murmur rippled through the room. One man whispered, 1,500 acres? Marge's smile wavered. "Well, the board acted in good faith to align community boundaries with county maps." I pulled a folded paper from my jacket and set it on the table. "You mean these county maps? The ones I drew 30 years ago?" She blinked, unsure whether to be offended or afraid. "You're a surveyor?" Retired, I said. Which means I actually know how to read the fine print. The room went silent except for the whir of the ceiling fan. I spread out my copies of the original plat records, deed numbers highlighted, property boundaries clearly marked. You see that line there? I said, pointing to the thick black boundary separating my land from the subdivision. That's where the HOA ends. Always has. Always will. Someone in the back chuckled quietly. Another whispered, "Guess they messed with the wrong guy." Marge adjusted her glasses. "We'll review this with the compliance committee." "Good idea," I said. "They'll need a map and maybe a flashlight." I gathered my papers and turned to leave. Just before I reached the door, I looked back. "Oh, and Marge, next time you decide to expand the neighborhood, try asking the neighbor first." Back home, the sun was just setting over the lake, casting the water in that coppery light that makes everything look older, wiser. I sat on the porch, still shaking my head. They'd drawn a few lines on a map and convinced themselves reality would move to match. Scout rested his chin on my boot as I scratched behind his ear. "You ever seen folks trip over their own clipboard, boy?" He huffed like he understood. That night, I got an email from Rick, an old friend from my county days. Subject line: "Saw the HOA thing in the paper, call me." He'd heard about their expansion project. Apparently, they'd filed some paperwork with the zoning office claiming administrative oversight of my land for environmental preservation. Rick said it wasn't illegal, just sloppy, but it could become a nightmare if left unchecked. I stared at the email for a long time before replying, "Let's meet." Something in me shifted that evening. Not quite anger yet, but the sense that I was standing on a line someone else had drawn in pencil and called permanent. I knew how maps worked. I knew how easy it was to erase and redraw a border when nobody's paying attention. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I didn't fix this soon, the next generation of Lakeview homeowners would think they owned a piece of my history. I poured one last cup of coffee, the bitter kind that tastes like resolve, and watched the lights flicker across the lake. Behind those windows were people who genuinely believed they were right. People who thought paperwork made property. I wasn't angry, not yet, but I'd stopped laughing. "I thought that was the end of it," I muttered to Scout, who wagged his tail once before curling up beside me. I was wrong. There's a point when irritation becomes something sharper, still calm, but with edges. That's where I was the morning the third envelope arrived. This one was heavier, as if arrogance itself had weight. Inside was a bright red notice. Final warning. Failure to comply with Community Greenbelt Ordinance. They'd raised the fine to $5,000 and tacked on a line about further legal action. Legal action on my land. I set the paper down and laughed so hard Scout ran under the table. That laughter didn't last long. The HOA wasn't bluffing. Attached to the notice was a printout from the county database showing Lakeview community jurisdiction boundaries, including every inch of my 1,500 acres. Somehow, they'd managed to sneak it into the zoning records. That's when I stopped feeling amused and started feeling professional. They'd wandered into my world now, the world of surveys, plats, deeds, and very permanent ink. I drove into town and parked outside the county recorder's office, a squat brick building that smelled like old paper and bad coffee. My old friend Rick was still behind the counter, same as he'd been 15 years ago when I retired. "Well, if it isn't the man who measured half the county," he said, grinning. "What brings you back, Tom? Don't tell me someone's arguing with your compass again." "Worse," I said. "My HOA just annexed my property." He blinked. "Come again." I handed him the letter. His eyebrows went up as he skimmed it. "They filed a jurisdictional expansion? Without my signature," I said. Rick leaned back in his chair and whistled low. "You want me to pull their filings?" "Please," I said, "and get me the original parcel map for Lakeview. The first one, not the revised one." He disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with the faint hum of an ancient copy machine. When he returned, he carried a manila folder stuffed with papers. "Here," he said, setting it down. "You're not gonna like what you see." He was right. The HOA's expansion had been approved on a technicality. Someone had resubmitted the subdivision's boundary map using an expired plat from the 80s, the same one that used to list my land as adjacent development potential. They'd never filed the correction that removed it when the project ended. On paper, the HOA's territory now looked like a snake swallowing half the county. I tapped the map with my finger. They used the old plat as a base. Rick nodded. And they didn't file an ownership disclosure. That's sloppy. Sloppy's one word for it, I said. Illegal's another. Rick laughed. You planning to sue them? No, I said, folding the papers neatly. I'm planning to educate them. That night, I pulled my old drafting board out of storage. The thing still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. I unrolled every deed and plat I had, the yellowing paper curling at the edges like dried leaves. The lamp buzzed overhead as I started tracing lines. The real boundaries, not the imaginary ones Marge and her clipboard army had drawn. I marked every coordinate, every easement, every survey pin I'd ever driven into the soil myself. Then I found the one thing that made me smile, the mineral rights clause. Back when my grandfather registered the property, he'd separated the mineral and surface rights, an old trick for tax purposes. It meant that no one could claim ownership above ground without acknowledging the estate below. In other words, if they'd attached their subdivision map to my parcel ID, they'd technically built their homes on land I still controlled beneath the surface. I leaned back in my chair, letting that sink in. You wanted jurisdiction? I muttered. You got it. All the way down. The next few days were quiet. I worked carefully, methodically, like the old surveyor I was. I filled out the paperwork to reclaim my mineral and subsurface rights, converting them into a private land trust. I filed everything under Redding Family Holdings, LLC, the same name my father used decades ago. Rick helped me check the legal angles. You're sure about this? He asked one afternoon. Positive, I said. I'm not taking their homes. I'm just taking back what's mine. He chuckled. You realize what this means? On paper, you'll own everything under those houses, pipes, soil, even the foundations. Then they can start paying rent to the dirt, I said. Every signature felt like poetic justice, each notary stamp a punctuation mark in the world's driest revenge story. While most folks fight with lawyers or protests, I fought with paper. Paper never yells, never lies. It just waits for someone to read it. A week later, I took the whole stack down to the clerk's office. The young woman behind the counter looked nervous when I handed her the folder. All this for recording? Yes, ma'am, I said. Every page. She stamped the first document. What's this one for? Land preservation, I said with a straight face. Trying to maintain community aesthetics. She smiled politely, not realizing the irony. By the time I left, the filings were official. The deed book now listed the HOA's lots as encumbered by mineral estate reservation. I didn't celebrate. I just drove home, parked by the lake, and sat for a long time watching the sun sink behind the treeline. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that comes from winning quietly. No shouting, no scenes, just precision. The next day, I heard it. Across the lake, someone shouting. Who changed our property records? The voice echoed off the water like a sermon. I walked down to the dock and saw Marge on her porch, waving a stack of papers like she was fanning a fire. That evening, I got a voicemail. Tom, this is Marjorie Benson. We need to speak immediately. There's been some confusion with the county, and your name has appeared on several of our homeowners' deeds. Please call me back. I didn't. Instead, I poured myself a bourbon and took it out to the porch. The air smelled like pine and smoke from someone's grill. Scout snored beside my chair, twitching at the sound of frogs down by the water. I looked over at my land. The same land my father cleared with his bare hands, the same hill where my grandfather taught me how to use a compass. Now it was all mine again, every acre recognized by law. They thought I was just some old man with too much time on his hands, I said softly. Turns out, I've got time and a ruler. The next morning, I woke to find a certified letter tucked into my gate. Urgent. Request for meeting. Inside, the HOA demanded clarification of ownership boundaries in light of recent recording anomalies. The tone was polite, but the desperation leaked through every line. I wrote back a one-sentence reply: all inquiries should be directed to Redding Family Holdings, LLC. It was both true and infuriatingly vague, which made it perfect. Over the next few days, I started noticing small things. Cars idling outside my gate, board members pacing with clipboards, one even holding a printed copy of a county map like it was a shield. They had no idea what to do. You can't fine a man for owning the ground under your feet. The whole thing amused me more than I'd like to admit. I'd sit on my porch in the evenings and imagine the next HOA meeting. Marge standing at the podium, trying to explain to 20 homeowners why their deeds suddenly had my family trust listed as a partial interest holder. The panic, the gossip, the endless emails. Bureaucracy eating itself alive. But beneath the humor was a strange piece. I wasn't doing this for revenge. Not really. I was doing it to remind them, and maybe myself, that not everything can be managed, scheduled, or landscaped into submission. Some things, like land, like people, have history too deep for bylaws to touch. As the sun went down, the lake caught fire again with that copper glow. I leaned back, feeling the quiet settle in. Somewhere across the water, I heard Marge's voice rising in frustration. I smiled and took another sip of bourbon. They had no idea what was coming. For a few days it was blissfully quiet. Too quiet, the kind of calm that means a storm's building on the other side of town hall paperwork. I spent those mornings walking the fence line, checking the markers, making sure every survey pin still stood firm where my grandfather set them. I didn't have to wait long before the rumble came. The first knock came just after breakfast. 2 homeowners, nervous, polite, stood at my gate, each holding a letter. Mr. Redding, the taller one said. We got this in the mail, and your name's on it. I took the paper, scanning it fast. It was an official notice from the county. Cross-linked parcel rights and encumbrances recorded to Redding Family Holdings, LLC. The poor guy looked like he'd seen a ghost. What does that mean? He asked. I smiled kindly. It means your HOA tried to build a castle on sand. I just put the bedrock back where it belongs. By noon, there were cars lined up on the street, board members, homeowners, real estate agents, all panicking in their Sunday best. Across the lake, Marge's voice carried clear as a church bell, barking orders through a bullhorn like she was coordinating a military evacuation. Everyone meet at the community center. Emergency session in 1 hour. I sat on the porch and watched them scurry. It was the most entertainment I'd had in months. By evening, the entire subdivision had crammed into that beige community center. Someone must have sent me an invite by accident, because there was a flyer pinned to my mailbox. Urgent, all homeowners required to attend. Well, technically, I was a homeowner too. So I went. The air inside was electric. Angry whispers, shuffling papers, that faint smell of cheap coffee and panic sweat. The crowd parted when I walked in, like Moses with a land deed. Marge sat up front, face red, hair pulled so tight it looked like she'd been vacuum sealed. Next to her sat a frazzled man in a suit, probably the HOA lawyer, poor soul. She cleared her throat and tried for calm authority. Residents, it seems there has been an administrative irregularity involving Mr. Redding's property filings. Irregularity? Someone shouted. My bank just called. They said my title's under review. Marge's voice cracked. It's temporary. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, and said, That's one word for it. Heads turned. The room went so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Tom, she said carefully, would you like to explain what exactly you've done? Sure, I said. I followed your advice. She blinked. Excuse me? You told me we all have to follow the rules, I said. So I did. Turns out, according to your own filings, every one of your houses sits right on my family's mineral estate. I just made that official. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man stood up and said, Wait, so you own the land under our homes? Technically, I said, just the mineral rights, but legally that's part of the land. Don't worry, I'm not drilling for oil, though I might start charging for water access. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else cursed under their breath. Marge slammed her binder shut. This is outrageous. You can't just take people's property. I didn't take it, I said. You sold it to yourselves using an outdated map. All I did was read the fine print you ignored. The lawyer cleared his throat, sweating through his collar. Mrs. Benson, I've spoken with the county recorder. Legally, he's within his rights. She turned on him. You're supposed to fix this. He held up his hands. I can't fix what's filed correctly. That's when chaos truly began. People shouted over one another, questions, accusations, threats of lawsuits. A woman in the front row actually started crying, wailing that she just painted the nursery. It would have been tragic if it wasn't so absurd. I slipped out before they could vote to burn me in effigy. The next day, I found 2 uniformed police officers waiting by my gate. I walked over slowly, coffee in hand. Morning, officers. Mr. Redding? One asked. That's me. We got a complaint from the Homeowners Association about a property dispute. They say you altered records. Altered? I said. No, sir. Corrected. Everything's on file with the county. They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. So, this is a civil issue then? Exactly. I nodded. And civilly speaking, they can kiss my survey stakes. The younger one chuckled before catching himself. All right, Mr. Redding. We'll mark it as resolved. When they left, I waved politely at the neighbors watching from behind their blinds. I knew the gossip threads would explode that afternoon. Sure enough, within hours, I got a call from a local reporter. Mr. Redding, this is Jenna Brooks with Channel 7. Can you confirm that the Lakeview HOA illegally incorporated your property? Confirm, I said. Honey, I've got the receipts. The story aired that night. Veteran landowner reclaims property after HOA mix-up. They even interviewed one of the board members who, in classic fashion, blamed confusing paperwork. By the next morning, I was a minor celebrity. Strangers drove by to snap pictures of my infamous gate. The HOA, on the other hand, was imploding. Their group emails leaked online. Panic threads full of blame and frantic questions. One gem read, "Can we revoke a homeowner's rights retroactively?" Another simply said, "Who let him file that?" That evening, as the sun dropped low, I heard footsteps crunching on gravel. Marge marched up my driveway with a thick folder clutched to her chest. Her lipstick looked battle-ready. "Tom," she said, voice trembling with fake calm. "We need to talk." "Always a pleasure," I said, leaning on the fence post. "You can't sell what's under us," she said sharply. I smiled. "Funny. That's what I told you when you sold what was mine." Her jaw twitched. "We're going to sue." "Good luck," I said. "You'll have to sue yourself, technically." She stared at me for a long second, realizing I meant it. "You're destroying this community." "No," I said softly. "You are. I'm just reminding it who it belongs to." She turned on her heel and stormed off, the folder flapping against her hip like a wounded bird. That night, I sat on the porch again. Scout lay curled beside me, the air thick with the smell of rain coming in. Across the water, I could hear the faint echo of another emergency meeting. Voices raised, chairs scraping, thunder rolling in the distance like punctuation. I took a sip of bourbon and chuckled. The sound of chaos had never felt so peaceful. And that's when I paused for a moment, thinking about the folks out there watching this all unfold. People who've gotten those same ridiculous letters, those courtesy notices that feel anything but courteous. I'll tell you what, if you've ever dealt with an HOA like this, one that mistakes control for community, drop your story in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you love seeing poetic justice served cold. Let's see how many of us have survived HOA brutality. Anyway, back to the mess. The storm hit around midnight, real thunder this time, not metaphorical. Rain pounded the roof, wind shook the old shutters. I was half asleep when the motion lights flicked on. Through the rain, I saw 2 figures. Neighbors again, this time carrying umbrellas and looking sheepish. "Mr. Redding," one called out. "Sorry to bother you, but Marge told us to ask if you could sign something to restore order?" I grinned. Orders overrated. Come back when the coffee's hot and the bylaws are honest. They left without another word. The next morning, another letter waited at my gate. Hand-delivered, fancy envelope. I tore it open. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the county. Notice of pending review. Property adjustments filed by Lakeview HOA are under investigation. Translation: the county was finally catching on. Someone up the chain realized the HOA had overstepped badly. I stood there in the damp morning air, holding that letter, feeling the satisfaction settle deep and quiet. The game wasn't over yet, but it was turning. Then, just as I turned back toward the house, I saw her again, Marge, standing across the lake on her porch, hands on her hips, glaring like a general retreating from a lost war. Then, I said to myself, smiling as the wind whipped across the water, I got the letter that changed everything again. When the rain cleared, so did the noise. The HOA, for once, went quiet. No letters, no emails, not even the usual friendly reminders about mailbox paint or trash bin placement. But silence in suburbia never means peace. It means they're regrouping. I knew something was coming. It arrived 3 days later, in a certified envelope thick enough to choke a mailbox. Proposed resolution and settlement offer. The header read. I took it inside, poured myself a fresh coffee, and sat by the window while Scout snored under the table. The letter was long, pages of legal filler, but the summary was simple. The HOA wishes to resolve the matter amicably. They wanted me to relinquish the mineral rights, drop my filings, and sign a restoration of jurisdiction agreement. In return, they'd forgive all prior fines and refrain from further legal action. It was written like a favor, as if I should thank them for trying to undo their own stupidity. I called Rick at the county office. They want me to undo the filings, I said. He laughed so hard I could hear the echo off the file cabinets. After all that? Not a chance. Those deeds are rock solid. You've got them pinned like a butterfly in glass. I don't want to ruin anybody, I said, but I do want them to learn. Rick's voice softened. Then teach them. Just don't go easy on the midterms. That afternoon I drafted my reply. Dear Mrs. Benson, I appreciate your concern for community harmony. However, as I've learned, harmony without respect is just noise. I will consider releasing claim over the occupied parcels only under specific terms beneficial to both parties. I kept the language polite, almost painfully so, because nothing stings like manners used as armor. 2 days later, they called an emergency meeting, this time with a mediator from the county. I went, partly because I wanted to see the look on Marge's face, but mostly because I was curious how they'd try to dig themselves out of this hole they'd enthusiastically jumped into. The conference room was crowded with board members, lawyers, and 3 homeowners who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The mediator, a calm man in a gray suit, opened the floor. Mr. Redding, the HOA would like to present its proposal for restoring property clarity. Marge slid a folder toward me, avoiding eye contact. We're prepared to purchase the rights you filed for. I opened the folder. Inside was a check offer, $10,000. It was almost cute the way they tried to put a price tag on irony. I set the papers down. Marge, you tried to sell my land out from under me. You posted signs on my fence. You fined me for not mowing a field bigger than your entire neighborhood. And now you want to buy it back for less than what you spent on landscaping. She stiffened. We made a mistake. I nodded. You made several. The mediator cleared his throat. Mr. Redding, what would a fair resolution look like to you? I leaned back in my chair. Simple. The HOA purchases the rights back for $1 per home, on the condition that every dollar goes into a community improvement fund. Marge perked up slightly. That seems reasonable. I raised a hand. And the project funded by that money will be one I choose. That froze her. What kind of project? A fishing dock on the lake, I said. The same one you denied me a permit for 5 years ago. The room went quiet. Even the mediator smirked. That seems poetic. She tried to recover. We'll need board approval. You've got a week, I said. After that, the rent on your basements doubles. I walked out before they could respond. They agreed, of course. Pride only goes so far when a mortgage is involved. Within 10 days, every homeowner wrote a check for $1. The HOA held a public event to announce the restoration of property balance. Carefully worded so no one would have to admit fault. Local news showed up again, filming me shaking hands with the same people who'd once called me uncooperative. The headline the next morning made me laugh out loud. HOA buys back land from local veteran. Funds new dock. When the check for the community fund cleared, I got to work. I hired a few local guys, all retired tradesmen who knew how to build things without overcomplicating them. We hauled lumber, poured concrete, and laid boards by hand. The sound of hammers on would carried across the lake every evening. Some of the younger neighbors came by to help. Turns out, once you remove the rules and the resentment, people can be decent. Marge showed up on the final day of construction, clipboard in hand as always. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. "It's a nice dock," she said softly. "It's not a dock," I said, tightening the last bolt. "It's a reminder." She sighed. "We never meant to." "I know," I interrupted. "You meant well. Most people who cause trouble do." She didn't argue, just stood there a moment longer, then turned to leave. "Thank you for fixing the paperwork," she said quietly. "Thank you for proving why I had to." When the dock was finished, the community held a small gathering. Nothing official, just neighbors bringing folding chairs and coolers. Kids ran along the edge, men fished off the end, women swapped stories. For the first time, Lakeview looked like a community instead of a bureaucracy. I stood at the edge of the dock with Scout at my side, watching the reflection of porch lights dance on the water. Someone handed me a paper plate with pie and said, "Glad you stuck it to them, Tom." I smiled. Didn't stick it to anyone, just redrew the lines. That night, as the crowd drifted home, I sat alone at the end of the dock. The boards creaked under me, warm from the day's sun. I thought about my father, about the old maps rolled up in his desk, about how he used to say, "Land's not about owning dirt, it's about earning peace." I think I finally understood what he meant. The next morning, I got one last letter from the HOA. Only this time, it wasn't a fine or a warning. It was a printed note on official stationery. "Dear Mr. Redding, thank you for your service to our country and to the Lakeview community. The board wishes to express its gratitude for your contributions." I pinned it to the corkboard beside the very first violation notice, the one about mowing the field. Same letterhead, same logo. Two sides of the same absurd coin. Later that week, a new neighbor moved in next door. Nice couple from upstate. The husband stopped by with a handshake and a grin. "You must be the guy who made the HOA pay rent." I chuckled. "Something like that." He nodded toward the dock. "Heard you built that yourself." "With a little help," I said. "Community project." He laughed. "Guess there's hope for us yet." After he left, I sat back on the porch, Scout stretched at my feet, and watched the water ripple under a soft breeze. The lake was calm again, mine, theirs, everyone's, the way it should have been all along. I took a long sip of coffee and smiled. "Funny thing about power," I said to no one in particular. "It's lighter when you stop pretending to hold it." The sprinklers across the street kicked on, the familiar hiss marking the start of another ordinary day. Somewhere behind me, the wind rattled the old survey stakes leaning against the shed, like ghosts of boundaries long erased. Before I went inside, I looked once more at the dock. Sturdy, simple, built with care. A line drawn right where it should be. "They finally learned," I said softly, almost amused. "You don't mess with a man who reads the fine print." A year passed after the dust settled, though if you'd asked anyone new to Lakeview, they'd never know a war had been fought there. The lawns looked the same, the mailboxes still matched, and the water in the lake shimmered just as it always had. But the air was different, softer, less patrolled, like the neighborhood had finally unclenched. These days, mornings start the same way for me. Coffee in hand, Scout stretched out at my feet, the smell of wet earth and dew rising from the grass. Sometimes I hear the faint sound of someone hammering down by the dock, patching a board or painting the rail. It's funny, The thing that once symbolized conflict turned into the one spot everyone can agree on. Kids fish there, couples watch the sunset, and on Saturdays, a few of the guys gather to tell tall tales about catfish that got away. I never did rejoin the HOA. Not that they ever asked again. The organization technically still exists, but it's smaller now, humbler, less like a private government, more like a neighborhood club. They stopped calling their rules ordinances and started calling them guidelines. I suppose that's progress. Every now and then, Marge passes by when I'm out walking scout. She waves and I wave back. We don't talk about what happened. I think she's embarrassed, but in a human way, not the righteous kind that used to color her every sentence. Her husband even helped me fix a fence post last month. Progress again. Some nights, I catch myself wondering what would have happened if I just ignored that first letter. Maybe they'd have swallowed another 100 acres before the county caught it. Maybe they'd have paved a parking lot where my father's old oak still stands. I guess that's the thing about small injustices. They grow fast when you don't weed them early. But I also think about how it all ended. No shouting, no court battles, no ruined lives. Just paperwork, patience, and the slow satisfaction of watching common sense win for once. It's rare these days. Most folks think revenge has to be loud. Turns out, silence and a well-timed filing fee can be just as effective. The other morning, I stopped by the dock just as the sun was breaking over the water. The light hit the boards in stripes of gold, and for a second, I could almost see my father standing there, hands on his hips, surveying the horizon the same way he used to survey land. I smiled, thinking how he'd laugh if he knew his son won a neighborhood war with nothing but a pen. A couple of neighbors wandered down, rods in hand. "Morning, Tom," one of them called. "Morning," I said. "Water's calm today," he added. "Always is when folks mind their own property lines," I replied. He chuckled. "Around here, that counts as a joke with historical significance. The dock has become a kind of truce zone. The HOA holds its meetings there now. Open to everyone, no fancy binders or microphones, just a few lawn chairs and coffee in thermoses. The bylaws are shorter, too. The first line even quotes something I said once, though I didn't realize it until they read it aloud. Rules should protect peace, not replace it. I'll admit it felt good hearing that echo back at me. It's strange how the smallest battles become the ones people remember most. Nobody here talks about mortgages or property values anymore. They talk about how the old man down by the lake reminded everyone that common sense still counts. I don't correct them. Let the myth grow. Maybe it'll keep the next power-hungry board in check. Sometimes I sit out at dusk, and the cicadas start their chorus just as the streetlights flicker on. The air smells like rain and grass clippings, and somewhere across the lake, a dog barks at nothing in particular. That's the sound of normal life returning. The kind of normal you don't realize you miss until you've spent a year fighting bureaucracy with a ruler. Last month, a young couple moved into one of the newer homes. They came by to introduce themselves, holding a plate of cookies that looked nervous just to be there. "We heard stories," the husband said, half laughing. "Something about an HOA rebellion?" I nodded. "Something like that." His wife smiled. "Well, we're glad to be here. Everyone says it's peaceful now." "It is," I said, and meant it. When they left, I watched them drive off and felt something like relief. Maybe the next generation will treat land and each other with a little more respect. There are still echoes, though. Last week, someone taped a notice on the community bulletin board about decorative yard limitations. I walked by, tore it off, and pinned it back up upside down. Nobody's replaced it since. Maybe they got the message. On quieter days, I take the boat out to the far end of the lake, where the trees lean over the water like old friends whispering secrets. That's where I think best. The reflection of the sky on the surface makes it hard to tell where one ends and the other begins, kind of like ownership, I guess. People forget that boundaries are only real if they're drawn in good faith. One afternoon, Marge joined me down there, of all people. She stood awkwardly at the edge of the dock, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Peace offering," she said. I took one and nodded. "You know, I thought I'd have to move after all that mess." "I thought you'd sue us," she admitted. "I thought about it," I said. But lawsuits don't teach lessons. Paperwork does. She laughed. A real laugh this time. We redid the bylaws, she said. Cut them down from 40 pages to 6. You were right. Less is more. Wasn't trying to be right, I said. Just trying to be left alone. She nodded slowly. Well, you got both. We watched the water in silence for a while. When she left, she paused halfway down the dock and said, For what it's worth, Tom, the neighborhood's better because of you. I didn't answer right away. When I finally spoke, I just said, That's all I ever wanted to hear. Later that night, I pinned her thank you note next to the old HOA letters. It's become a little wall of irony in my kitchen. A timeline of absurdity to gratitude. The first letter, the fine, the settlement, and now a simple handwritten line. Thanks for your patience. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing that patience, of all things, was what won. Not yelling, not threats, just outlasting nonsense with reason. I suppose that's the real moral of this story, if there is one. You can't stop people from being petty, but you can stop them from thinking it pays. Bureaucracy feeds on reaction. The minute you stop reacting, it starves. I've had folks write me letters since the news story aired. People from all over the country telling me about their own HOA nightmares. Some lost their homes, some fought back. Most just needed someone to say, You're not crazy. The rules really are that dumb. I read every one. Some nights I even write back. Maybe that's the closest I'll ever get to being a teacher. It's funny, though. After everything, I don't feel bitter. I actually feel lighter. Maybe because I didn't just win. I learned something too. There's a freedom that comes with not needing to prove anything anymore. You just live, quietly, and let your fences, and your paperwork, speak for themselves. One evening, as the sun sank low, I saw Marge's porch light flicker on. She waved, and this time, she used her whole hand. Scout barked once like applause. I laughed, shaking my head. So if your HOA ever sends you a letter like mine, I said out loud to the quiet, remember, you can't control the petty, but you can outsmart it. And just like that, the wind shifted across the lake, carrying the smell of rain and a hint of victory that never quite fades. The kind that doesn't need witnesses or headlines, just a man, a dog, a dock, and the peace he built one piece of paperwork at a time.